Good evening, I'm Hafiz Marzukhi. Our top stories for tonight. Trump proposes 100% tariff on semiconductors. And Thailand, Cambodia agree to strict ceasefire. All this and more coming up on AWANI International. President Donald Trump announces the United States is imposing a 100% tariff on imported semiconductors. However, companies manufacturing in the US or committed to doing so are exempt from the tariff. This measure is part of Trump's broader push to return manufacturing to American soil. Trump warned that companies breaking promises to build US factories will be charged retroactively. He said if companies fail to build, the tariff will be applied later and must be paid. The plan is not yet a formal policy, and unclear implementation details are already causing global concern and uncertainty.
Various other places, and they're coming to the United States. So in other words, we'll be putting a tariff on of approximately 100%.
Semiconductor products exported from Malaysia to the US will remain exempt from the 19% reciprocal tariff that takes effect tomorrow. Investment, Trade and Industry Minister Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Abdul Aziz says this is because Washington has yet to formally announce its plan to impose tariffs on semiconductor chips produced outside the US.
The recently concluded negotiations with the US, between Malaysia and the US, and of course the other countries as well, semiconductor was excluded. So that 19% that Malaysia achieved during our negotiations with the US excluded semiconductor, because semiconductor is seen as economic security, and under the Security Act, under Section 232, they are doing investigation. They have given a timeline until end of December, and obviously that's too long for President Trump. So what has happened is that he said within a week we will know more details, and I've reached out to my counterpart in the US as well.
Separately, in Parliament, Zafrul said his ministry would conduct outreach sessions with exporters and industry players across the supply chain to help mitigate the impact of any future semiconductor tariff. He added that the government will also encourage industry players to diversify export markets. Malaysia exported nearly 120 billion ringgit worth of electrical and electronic products to the US in 2024, with semiconductor products alone making up 60.6 billion ringgit.
Now, as global tensions over trade dominate headlines, Thailand and Cambodia agree to strictly uphold a ceasefire along their shared border. Thailand and Cambodia also agreed to hold the next General Border Committee, or GBC, meeting within 1 month from 7th of August. The agreement was reached during an extraordinary GBC meeting, which concluded in Kuala Lumpur on Thursday. Thailand's acting Defence Minister, General Natapon Narpanit, said the meeting aimed to restore peace and stability along the border. The agreement includes 5 key outcomes, including forming a temporary observer team of ASEAN military attaches from both countries. Malaysia will lead the observer team, which will monitor from their respective countries without crossing the border. The talks follow a 28th July ceasefire brokered in Putrajaya by Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim. We have more after the break. Stay tuned.
Tariffs on imports of products from China reaching up to 145%.
Tariffs on the rest of the world are sitting at 10%, with the potential for reciprocal tariffs to be reimposed within 90 days.
Kunjungan rasmi Presiden China ke Malaysia ini menunjukkan komitmen kedua-dua negara untuk meningkatkan hubungan diplomatik ke tahap yang lebih strategik.
As protectionism and global trade tensions rise, countries such as Malaysia are pushed to rethink their economic playbooks. AWANI international correspondent Fei Kwan reports from Praxis 2025 on the call to build trust alongside trade routes.
Thanks, Hafiz. I'm here at Praxis 2025 here in Hilton, Kuala Lumpur, where this year's theme, From Fracture to Future, calls for renewed cooperation in an increasingly volatile world. Now, rising protectionism is, of course, creating major headwinds for Malaysia as trade, climate, and even connectivity come under pressure. So, to unpack what this means for Malaysia and the region, I'm joined by Datin Lorela Chia. She is the founding president of the Malaysia Association of Sustainable Supply Chains. As of late in Malaysia, we've heard a lot about the need to diversify our markets and to reduce reliance on traditional trade partners. So in the face of rising protectionism and supply chains now under pressure, what do you think? Have we as a country actually done enough? And where do you see the biggest opportunities for deeper cooperation moving forward?
I think first, true to the theme, I think we should not look at things in a fragmented way, right? So we used to say break down silos, right? So that's actually what it is. Number one is to stop looking at things from piecemeal perspective. That's still a fragmented lens. If you're wearing a fragmented lens, the solution you have would be fragmented, right? And that's not really future-proofing. I think right now, what we can look at is what I would like to call a trust infrastructure, right? It's, well, to put it very simply, I think in times of difficulty or uncertainty, who do you want to trade with? Who do you want to deal with? These are people you trust, right? So relationship building and trust building. What does this mean in a practical sense? I think when you talk about infrastructure, people think about airports and roads and ports and all that. But what the other things? The credibility of our data, the reliability of certifications, because ESG is how countries and sectors evaluate things, right? The transparency of our supply chains, these all build trust, and collectively they form a trust infrastructure. And one would say that if your trust infrastructure is strong enough and reliable enough, and people buy into that, then it's easier for you to move things, it's easier for you to negotiate things, it's easier for you to look for new markets, it's easier for you to innovate, it's easier for you to find partnerships. So in that sense, are we doing enough there? I think that should be the question. Yeah,
looking further ahead at these long-term steps. And I do wonder though, because as mentioned in your session earlier, that we can't expect things to immediately bounce back even after US President Donald Trump's second term comes to an end. And in that sense, you know, when we're looking at the bigger ecosystem, it's important for Malaysia to kind of prioritize reforms to ensure that we're not just adapting to the shifting global order and the new generation trading order, but rather being part of it and helping to reshape it. Yes. So I wonder where that trust infrastructure comes into play then, especially with a landscape that's always like dominated by major powers.
That's an interesting question. You see, when we talk about adapting, we're responding. So when we respond, it's like the narrative about ESG, right? Beginning with compliance. So when we talk about adapting, we are still talking about what we need to do and how we adapt to that. That's compliance, right? Then for individuals or even businesses, we need to move from compliance, being forced to do something, into ownership, putting our personal values into it as individuals, and for companies looking at it, how does this generate competitive advantage, right? But for individuals to mature, we really need to move towards stewardship. So beyond embedding my personal values into what I believe in or what I'm doing, I need to look into how I'm nurturing the other people, the people around me, my ecosystem, right? For businesses, this means how do I look at what was a compliance, which is now a competitive advantage? How do I use that as a launchpad for innovation? Right. And this entire string, right? Trust infrastructure is about the credibility of your data, it's about the credibility of certification. So it's everywhere at every stage. It's also a mindset, it's also a behavior change. Once you have that, I think it's easier to look at how we can lead as opposed to follow.
Yep. All right. Well, Thank you so much, Datin, for sharing your insights. That was Datin Lorela Chia from the Malaysia Association of Sustainable Supply Chains. I'm Faye Kwan, reporting here from Praxis 2025. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Faye. Facing pressure from rising tariff threats, Apple pledges an additional $100 billion investment in the United States. US President Donald Trump announces the commitment, framing it as a major step towards bringing tech manufacturing back to American soil.
The pledge lifts Apple's total US investment plan to $600 billion over the next 4 years. Earlier this year, the company committed $500 billion and promised to create 20 new jobs across the country. Apple's new investment will expand its US supply chain and advance manufacturing operations. However, it still falls short of Trump's demand to fully relocate iPhone production to the United States. Apple CEO Tim Cook said many iPhone components, such as chips, glass, and Face ID modules, are already made in the US, but added that final assembly would remain overseas for now.
In a sharp escalation of trade tensions, United States President Donald Trump imposes an additional 25% tariff on Indian goods. The move responds to India's continued imports of Russian oil and marks the most serious downturn in US-India relations since Trump's return to office in January.
The new duties, effective 21 days after August 7th, will raise tariffs on some Indian exports to 50%. This marks one of the highest tariff rates imposed by the US on any of its trading partners to date. In response, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said he would never compromise the interests of the country's farmers. Modi acknowledged that defending these sectors could come at a personal cost, but said he was prepared to bear it.
United States President Donald Trump says China could be the next target of trade tariffs following similar action taken against India. Trump says additional tariffs on China could happen depending on how events unfold.
He added that more secondary sanctions are likely as part of a broader effort to pressure Russia to end its war in Ukraine. While Trump did not provide specific details, he confirmed that other countries, possibly including China, could face similar measures. He pointed to India as a recent example, noting that action had already been taken there. Last week, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned that China could also face new tariffs if it continued buying Russian oil.
US President Donald Trump will meet his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in the coming days to discuss the war in Ukraine. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov says preparations are underway for the bilateral meeting to take place. In fact, according to Vyuri, Putin mentions Russia has many friends who are willing to help organize events of this kind, and the President of the United Arab Emirates, UAE, could be one. However, he adds that the decision may come later, but UAE would be one of the most suitable places for the meet.
Speaking at the White House on Wednesday, Trump said there was a good chance of meeting both Russia and Ukraine's leaders in person soon to push for an end to the war. He added that talks between his special envoy and Putin in Moscow had been highly productive. The announcement comes just days before Trump's Friday deadline for Russia to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine or face fresh sanctions. If the summit goes ahead, it would mark the first in-person meeting between a US and Russian president in over 4 years. The last was in June 2021, when former President Joe Biden met one-on-one with Putin.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia now appears more open to a ceasefire, but warns the details are crucial. The remarks came following a call with United States President Donald Trump, also joined by European allies.
He maintained that neither Ukraine nor the United States should be deceived by Moscow's diplomatic signals. He reiterated that Ukraine will continue to defend its independence and called for a lasting and reliable peace, one that requires Russia to end the war it started. His comments came just hours after Trump announced great progress from a meeting between his special envoy Steve Witkoff and Russian President Vladimir Putin. However, Trump gave no specifics about what had been agreed.
That report wraps up AWANI International tonight. Stay tuned for our reports on the rivalries, strategies and the shifts behind the power affairs driving the new global order. Visit international.astroawani.com for more. Be sure to follow our social media accounts. I'm Hafiz Marzukhi. Thank you for watching. Good night.